You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
Highlights of the news today, 7th of July 2014. Man shot dead and 2 injured in gun and knife attack during violent outbreak involving hundreds of people on streets of Birmingham. Executions will take place in Trafalgar Square, Brit fighting in Syria claims. About 40 politicians on UK paedophile ring report. Denmark, Lars Hedegaard among the producers of new anti-Islam animation. Dutch court Black Pete is negative stereotype. Sweden, Green MP likens jihadists to World War II freedom fighters. ISIS head football or Palestinian barbecued kid and his beaten American cousin. Canadian city bans events associated with Christians. Mugabe calls for an end to white farmers in Zimbabwe. Thought for the day, untold dangers in the wings. And 2 for 1 day Monday. UK news. Man shot dead and 2 injured in gun and knife attack during violent outbreak involving hundreds of people on streets of Birmingham. A man in his 20s has been shot dead and 2 others left in hospital with bullets and knife wounds after 300 youths clashed on the streets of Birmingham. The main victim, named locally as Ikram Elahi, died in hospital after suffering a single gunshot wound following a street battle over a mystery dispute last night. 3 men in total were rushed to hospital after police were called to the Sparkbrook area of Birmingham at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday. 2 of the men had been shot while the third suffered stab wounds. Local MP Roger Godsiff said today he was liaising with police and said there are plenty of people in the area who express concerns that particular properties are being used as drugs dens. World at 8. Allow strangers into your towns and this is what you will get, and it will increase. Executions will take place in Trafalgar Square, Brit fighting in Syria claims. Young Britons fighting in Syria are claiming that they will bring the war back to British soil. One man currently fighting in Syria has claimed that the UK should be frightened of the skills he has learnt there. A Twitter account thought to belong to Nasa Mutana 20 has a picture showing what appear to be improvised explosive devices in a garage. The caption reads, "So the UK is afraid I'd come back with skills I've gained." Another Brit who has joined the fighting has claimed that public executions will be staged in London's Trafalgar Square, according to the Sunday People. The man, using the name Abu Dagmar el-Brittani, has claimed that the holy war will be waged in Britain. World at 8. Yup, I'm all for public executions, only the executees will not be white Christians. That I can guarantee. About 40 politicians on UK paedophile ring report. UK police have opened an investigation into claims of a Westminster paedophile ring, saying they have a list of about 40 alleged child abusers, including over 10 current and former British politicians. Whistleblower Peter McKelvey, whose claims prompted Operation Fernbridge, disclosed in his latest report that up to 40 members of Parliament and peers knew about or took part in the child abuse network. Operation Fernbridge is a Scotland Yard investigation into allegations of a paedophile network with links to Downing Street. Lawmakers, including former ministers and household names from all 3 main political parties, are included on the list. Some of the alleged child abusers remain active in the UK Parliament, while several others, including Cyril Smith and Pete Morrison, have already died. I believe there are sufficient grounds to carry out a formal investigation into allegations of up to 20 MPs and Lords over the last 3 to 4 decades, some still alive and some dead. The list is there, McKelvey said. At least one witness has told police that he was abused by a Tory MP when he was under 10 years old in the 1980s. Prime Minister David Cameron has ordered Mark Sedwell, the Permanent Secretary for the UK's Home Office, to conduct an internal investigation into what happened to the dossier. Other cases of child sexual abuse have been reported in the country. World at 8. This is nothing new, but it is proving very profitable, isn't it? Hunt the old white guy and start remembering. European news. Denmark, Lars Hedegaard among the producers of new anti-Islam animation. The controversial Danish anti-Islamist Lars Hedegaard is among the backers of a new controversial animation film about the life of the Islamic prophet Muhammad and his marriage to a 6-year-old girl. Aisha and Muhammad, which is scheduled to be released, was made by Pakistani director Imran Firasat and co-produced by a number of European anti-Islamists, including Hedegaard, who survived an assassination attack last year. Here in Europe we live in constant fear of Islamic terrorism, Hedegaard says in the trailer of the film. Islam is increasingly robbing us of our freedom of expression and shrinking our liberties. The video, which does not flatter the prophet, claims to portray Muhammad as he was conveyed in the Quran, including his beliefs and teachings. That's how one can understand Islam, Hedegaard contends. World at 8, a brave man, braver than our pro-Muslim cowards. Dutch court Black Pete is negative stereotype. Black Pete, the traditional sidekick to the Dutch St Nicholas, is a negative stereotype of black people, a court in Amsterdam has ruled. It said the capital must review the character's involvement in the annual festivities in November-December. The Dutch version of the St Nicholas legend has him and armies of Black Petes arriving by steamboat from Spain. Previous calls to ban Black Petes with their blackened faces, red lips and afro wigs have caused outrage. On Thursday, Amsterdam's regional court said the image of Black Pete with his thick red lips being a stupid servant gives rise to a negative stereotyping of black people. It said many black Amsterdammers felt discriminated against. World at 8 shows how ignorant people are. Black Pete is actually a Moor and gives out presents to the kids. There's nothing negative about this stereotype. If you're black, you're black. Why be ashamed of it? Those Amsterdammers can go home if they like. If they take exception, they will certainly hate the thought for today. Sweden, Green MP likens jihadists to World War II freedom fighters. A Green Party MP has caused a stir after likening Swedish jihadists in Syria to Swedish freedom fighters in Finland during World War II. The comments came on during a seminar in Almdalen about Islamophobia. On hand were Integration Minister Erik Ullenhag and Green Party MP Mehmet Kaplan, who is the former spokesman for the Muslim Council of Sweden. While the talk was mostly about Islamophobia, matters took a turn when the Integration Minister said there was a problem with young Muslims heading to Syria to be jihadists, according to political scientist Stefan Olsson, who was on the scene. Ullenhag's comment prompted a reaction from Kaplan, who said the jihadists were nothing to worry about and were similar to Swedish freedom fighters who joined the Finns in World War II to fight the Soviets. World at 8. European history from a Muslim, great. Many Muslims fought for Hitler as well. There's no comparison in history. These would-be jihadists are not European, no matter where they were born. They're Muslims and would be better off staying in Syria or Iraq or anywhere not European. World news. ISIS head football or Palestinian barbecued kid and his beaten American cousin. ISIS has just crucified 8 Muslim men for not being extreme enough in their Islamic practice. They kept their bodies on display in a town square in Iraq for 3 days. The 9th crucified man survived. Horrifying, yes. Equally horrifying are the mass beheadings and the football games ISIS has been playing with for human heads. However, the leading Western media are focusing mainly on the Palestinian Arab boy who was burnt alive. Now a cousin of this same boy has alleged that he was badly beaten by masked Israeli soldiers and he has the photos to prove it. Why such a focus? World at 8. So no doubt a pal was there with his mobile phone all ready for it. Lovely. Canadian city bans events associated with Christians. In Canada, at least in the city of Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, now all you need to qualify for persecution is some vague, undefined association with divisive groups, Christians, that promote homophobia and other expressions of hate. On May the 5th, the Nanaimo City Council voted 8-1 to ban simulcasts of a worldwide leadership conference from being shown at the Vancouver Island Conference Centre, a public facility, because some unspecified number of the LBGT community were upset by the conference's associations with persons and organisations with a long history of promoting homophobia, blah blah. The councillors use the rest of their time to make hysterical equations of Christians with Islamic jihad groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, etc. World at 8. These councillors want a good beating and a lesson in history. Where the hell is Canada anyway? Is it that place at the top of the US that used to do good bacon? Mugabe calls for an end to white farmers in Zimbabwe. The president ratchets up his anti-white rhetoric after discovering some of his ministers were leasing back land to farmers that had been revoked in 2000. Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, has warned that in future no white person will be allowed to own land, as he unveiled a new farming settlement scheme west of the capital, Harare. "We fought these people," he said. "We can't be soft on them when it comes to land. We've not chased them away from this country. They're there in the industries and in the cities." World at 8. Fine, call up the Zulu Wars or Mau Mau or the countless atrocities perpetrated by Mugabe himself and forbid any African to come here and deport all the ones already here. Quid pro quo, you old bastard. Quid pro quo. The white farmers fed your starving and lazy people for years, so who's ungrateful now? Thought for the day: untold dangers in the wings. On reading and listening to the various news items, I've come to the usual conclusion: the things that should be worrying us are not, and the things which should be put on the back burner are being hailed as newsworthy, which they ain't. As usual, our propagandised media are all out on the Israelis for revenge attacks for the deaths of 3 youngsters killed with cold-blooded forethought, in fact kidnapped and killed, which is a death sentence in the States. So what do? They rake up a kid who still cannot speak English even though classed as an American citizen, who was a cousin of another dead Palestinian youth and who was simply watching the hysterical protests. Oh yeah, pull the other one. The whole caboodle is firmly set in the pro-Palestinian cause, and the media have forgotten the 3 original deaths at the bottom of it. These young Israeli men were not freedom fighters or demonstrating or part of Hamas. They were just ordinary Israeli citizens. The media will conveniently forget that one. Then we have Wimbledon, a definite no vote for Scotland here I feel, so a sodding bike race aptly misnamed La Tour de France, which occurred in deepest Yorkshire, has supplanted it. Why not go to France and pedal? The footie is still on and deeply forgotten, so the media is full of would-be Muslim tourists, as if they'd gone away for a sabbatical and come back, and in the paedophile scandal in Westminster, which is fast going the way of all white-based naughties in the press, firmly downward. We now have in Westminster pedos rising like the dead from the depth of the search engine of Avsal & Co. It has all the ingredients of a soap opera. If anyone thinks that paedophiles came about in the 20th century, they're mad. These awful deviants have been around for centuries, like any other sexual deviant. There's nothing new in the world, just unreported. As for Westminster, bases of absolute power always hold within them a mix of deviants and always will. It's been well known since the dawn of civilization that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so do cover-ups. There's always been a known link in the UK between show business, corporations, newspapers, politicians, the cabal and sex. As in other countries, we are legion in this, so why waste time and money when it's been going on so long and so uninterrupted? The victims might still be alive, but it all boils down to reputation and money, and not necessarily in that order. You may have gathered I'm firmly tongue-in-cheek over the news, because like the soaps recently that have taken a distinctly politically correct slant to the left and multiracialism, both of which I personally abhor, being a far-right nationalist, in fact practically sitting on the right knee of Attila the Hun matey. One article did me some good, and that was in the Daily Mail reporting that the French have jailed the Roma gang who sent their kids to beg in Paris. Good for them. Our lot would send them on a holiday with therapy at the British taxpayers' expense, and no naming or shaming here. So amidst all the chosen people's news for the blurbs, underneath there are 2 worrying factors. One, the ever-spreading Ebola in West Africa, and the Islamic rebellions within the UK. One totally ignored, and the other still coming up with that picture of these 3 so-called British retards sitting having a getting to know ISIS chat on Facebook. Someone just shoot them, will you? After all, they are combatants, aren't they? And accidents do happen. Just as the picture of that swollen-faced yoot has been shown all over the world, as has his burnt cousin, and yet the pictures of ISIS scroats playing footy with a human head have not. Why? What happened to the impartiality of the press? Gone to the moon, my friends. Everyone's gone to the moon. The news that hundreds of our brave men died in Iraq and Afghanistan for nothing is not news at all. Just blame the anti-war and pro-Muslim groups, both in the US, including their president, and the UK for withdrawing troops too soon and simply not finishing the job they were sent there to do, because of mainly Muslim terrorists attempting to recreate a 9/11 situation over here. What a joke. 7/7 was a prelude to what can be expected in the UK, and I ain't a Muslim cleric. If the Muslims need a reason to jihad all over the place, they take any reason they want, from simply migrating here, to living here, to not liking the locale or the food or even the weather. These people do not need an excuse or a reason, and that is what our governments must realise. When jihad is declared, it is declared for Allah, not for a real reason. But the one thing worrying me, for its lack of professional attention and the general wake-up call, is the Ebola in Africa. Over the last decade we've taken in millions of African migrants, most illegal. They vanished into the black economy of casual work, drugs and prostitution. We have taken in many more youngsters deliberately sent over here alone so that the UK can't send them back. All in all, our large Arab and EU migrants are more than equalled by the new black oil wave. And there is little need as Africa is growing larger in the corporate world, and I quote, "Africa has been the second fastest growing region in the world over the past 10 years, with average annual growth of 5.1% over the past decade, driven by greater political stability and economic reforms that have unleashed the private sector in many countries. Poverty is also on the retreat. A new consuming class has taken its place. Since 2000, 31 million African households have joined the world's consuming class. At the point when household incomes exceed $5,000, measured at purchasing power parity, consumers begin to direct more than half their income to things other than food and shelter. The continent has now around 90 million people who fit this definition. That figure is projected to reach 128 million by 2020. Now, when I tried to Google exactly how many migrants from Africa we've taken in, this figure was not available, just the figures from 2012 on HIV/AIDS. And these are official, which means they could be doubled. 2012, 31,800 African migrants living with HIV, 23% of which remain undiagnosed. At the end of 2012 there were 98,400 people living with HIV in the UK. Now, Ebola is an entirely different animal or virus. It can be carried without the carrier even knowing, and by the time his pals know it, it's too late for them. Now we, as soft-touch Britain, take in thousands of Africans every day, by plane, by lorry, by boat, and as most of them come through the EU, they just land here and run away. Now, Ebola has hit West Africa and is coming to the Ivory Coast and Senegal with ease. The figures are small at the moment, but large enough to worry the locals. 467 people have died so far, and the number is rising. Can someone somewhere tell me, are we still harbouring Africans from this part of the world in the bosom of the UK? Surely we've started some new checks and brought some officials in to monitor Africans from certain parts of Africa. I can hear shouts of Wacist from down here in Hampshire, but would you rather be a live Wacist or a dead Liberal? Ebola, more than Muslim terrorism, is a killer. It kills indiscriminately, it doesn't favour black over white or white over yellow. It is a virus and it is deadly. Now, the UK, more than Europe, with its namby-pamby history of favouring Negroes because of supposed misdeeds hundreds of years ago, is ripe for the Ebola pickings. We have women who marry them straight off the boat, who give them jobs and moreover houses within our communities, without any medical checks at all, thus the spread of heterosexual HIV/AIDS with our frantically coupling mixed-race yoot to whom the word Ebola does not exist, and moreover they couldn't spell it. Now, this is not a case of blaming the migrant game. This is a case of serious consequences if we do not make ourselves more proficient in spotting diseases from obvious sources. The UK does not have Ebola in the general population at the moment, so therefore it can only come in from other sources in Africa, and the main source is African migrants. Now, it could be a family member deliberately brought in and hidden. It could be a child not being left behind. Or it could even be a nurse or doctor who's been working with them. It isn't their faults they have contracted this terrible disease, but it is our fault and the fault of British officials if that disease is allowed to come into Britain, simply because we're too lazy or too politically correct to do a stop and search on illegals if we can get them. It is the general population that should be warned that if Ebola or a like-minded disease ever gets a hold in Britain, you can forget race wars or terrorists. This country would become a wasteland very quickly. We, unlike many countries in this world, have huge foreign communities made up of Africans, both Christian and Muslim, who are being added to day by day, year by year, and breeding. Many go back and forth through Africa and can bring Ebola back business class. It is not always the migrants who will achieve this. It sounds like a Muslim terrorist's dream for this country, but Ebola, like the atomic bomb, does not differentiate between colours or religions. We are but meat to be fed upon and killed. Like the top predator, it is. Please, British media, wake up to the real problems you could face, not the imagined ones. And finally, 2 for 1 Day Monday and arse jokes, or if you prefer, jokes about donkeys. An old hillbilly farmer had a wife who nagged him unmercifully. The only time he got his relief was when he was out ploughing with his old mule. One day his wife brought him lunch in the field. He drove the old mule into the shade, sat on a stump and began to eat his lunch. Immediately his wife began nagging him again. Complain, nag, it went on and on. All of a sudden the old mule lashed out with both hind feet, caught her smack in the back of the head, killed her dead on the spot. At the funeral, the minister noticed when a woman mourner would approach the old farmer, he would listen for a minute, then nod his head in agreement. But when a man mourner approached him, he would listen for a minute, then shake his head in disagreement. So after the funeral, the minister spoke to the old farmer and asked him why he nodded his head and agreed with the women, but always shook his head and disagreed with the men. The old farmer said, "Well, the women would come up and say something how nice my wife looked or how pretty her dress was, so I'd nod my head in agreement." "And what about the men?" the minister asked. "They wanted to know if the mule was for sale." And now we have the pastor's arse. The pastor entered his donkey in a race and it won. The pastor was so pleased with the donkey that he entered it again in the race and it won again. The local paper read, "Pastor's ass out front." The bishop was so upset with this kind of publicity that he ordered the pastor not to enter the donkey in another race. The next day the local paper headlines read, "Bishop scratches pastor's arse." This was too much for the bishop, so he ordered the pastor to get rid of the donkey. The pastor decided to give it to a nun in a nearby convent. The local paper, hearing of the news, posted the following headline the next day: "Nun has best arse in town." The bishop fainted. He informed the nun she would have to get rid of the donkey, so she sold it to a farmer for $10. The next day the paper read, "Nun sells arse for $10. This was too much for the bishop, so he ordered the nun to buy back the donkey and lead it to the plains where he could run wild. The next day the headlines read, "Nun announces her ass is wild and free." The bishop was buried the next day. The moral of this story is, being concerned about public opinion can bring you much grief and misery, even shorten your life. So be yourself and enjoy life. You've been listening to The World at 8. I'm Lynn Mozart and I wish you all a very good night.